wonderfully pleased to have been invited to do this and to be here and have a chance to talk with you about our book, Wine and War.
Absolutely. And it all began with that little man standing in his vineyard that you see there, wearing a suit. His name was Gaston Huet, and he lived in Vouvray and in the Loire Valley, of course. And he was, by all accounts, one of the greatest winemakers in France. Anyway, we happened to be in Vouvray to pick up some wine from him, and we were sitting in his office one day, chatting away merrily, when all of a sudden he got up and disappeared from the room. And we wondered what's going on. Well, a few minutes later, he returned with an unlabeled wine bottle and three empty glasses. He uncorked the bottle and began pouring, and a rich golden liquid filled the glasses, along with an incredible bouquet of honey and apricots, which absolutely filled the office room. Oh, we couldn't believe it. And anyway, Hewitt looks at us, smiles, and says, "Go ahead, taste it, and tell me when you think it was made." Well, it was so alive and so fresh that we figured it could have been made yesterday. But of course, we knew it wasn't, and so we began guessing. 1990, 1982, 1975. Hewitt would just shake his head, and a little smile would crease his face, and he'd invite us to guess again. Okay, 1969. Mm-mm. 64? No. The smile grew wider and wider. And finally, we said, okay, we'll try once more. 59, 1953. Well, by now, the grin on Hewitt's face was so wide it was not to be believed. We threw up our hands and we said, "You tell us. When was it made? When did you make this wine?" He replied, 1947. It's the best wine I have ever made. Well, it was certainly one of the best wines that we had ever tasted, but we couldn't help asking him, "Monsieur Huet, have you ever tasted anything better than this?" He replied, "Just once. It was when I was a prisoner of war in Germany." And that's when we sat back and began listening to one of the most amazing stories that we ever heard. It was a story of courage, hope, despair, and how a tiny glass of wine helped one man survive 5 years of captivity. When when Monsieur Huet was telling this, though, the smile on his face just disappeared almost automatically, and he grew very, very serious about this whole thing. And I don't know.
It was at that point we really wondered what other stories are out there about those years. What did wine mean to people? How did
Mhm.
they manage to make it? So that's the genesis of Wine and War, which was published 15 years ago.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, Hewitt said that he didn't even remember what the wine was. He said it was nothing special. It was really, inconsequential, and the glass was, well, no more than a thimbleful of it. But he said, it's the only wine I had in 5 years of captivity, and it was glorious, and it's something that I'll never forget. And so, Petey and I, of course, looked at each other and, began wondering how many other stories are out there begging to be told. And that's kind of how our book was launched. We began looking for these stories and taking notes.
Right. Well, as I said, that was 15 years ago. And since that time, Wine and War has been translated into more than 15 languages and published in, about 2 dozen countries. A real evergreen book. Surprisingly enough, one of our biggest markets has been and remains to be Germany. In addition to all of that, we recently sold rights for a movie, so we have our fingers crossed that even more good things may come from Wine and War. We feel extremely fortunate that we wrote the book, that we had a chance to do it when we did, because since then, nearly all of our main characters have passed away.
And one of them was Georges Hugel of the Hugel family in Alsace. Georges was drafted into the German army After the invasion, his brother Johnny happened to fight in the French army, so they were on opposite sides. But as we were working on our book, we had a few extra questions to ask Georges, and so I called his home, and his wife answered, and she said, "Oh dear, he just left the house. He's being escorted out to an ambulance outside. I'm afraid he's been diagnosed with cancer." And I thought, "Oh my God, I'm sorry I called. Please don't bother him." And she said, "Oh, no, 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 I'll go get him." Talk about embarrassing. Anyway, a few minutes later, George is on the phone, and I'm apologizing profusely. And George says, "No, don't apologize. If you have any questions, it's better to ask me while I'm alive than when I'm dead." So,
And we ran into one person after another who was as gracious and as generous as Georges Huguel was, which also was, in a way, a surprise to us because when we first started on the book, people said to us, "No one will talk to you. It's way too sensitive an issue." Well, perhaps it's because we're Americans and maybe a bit pushy, well, or persistent anyway. But people did talk to us, and to find a way to tell the story of what happened in France's wine regions during the occupation, we decided to focus on five separate families. The Hugels of Alsace, of course. We also used the Huettes in the Loire Valley, but then we went to the Miais in Bordeaux, Nonancourt, who was the family that ran Laurent Perrier in Champagne, and to the Drouins in Burgundy.
yeah, to appreciate just how much was about to change under the occupation, Robert Drouin of Maison Joseph Drouin in Beaune told us what life was like before the Germans invaded. I'll read here a little bit of what he said. Time, he said, was told by the church bells. They were the background music to life in the vineyards. It was a much simpler life, one that in some respects had changed very little since the Middle Ages. Days began early and lasted until work was done. There were no fixed hours. As they pruned, checked for maladies, and tied back shoots that had come loose, workers came to know each vine personally. There was almost a mystical connection as they let the vines set the rhythm and the pace of life. Drouin, incidentally, was only 8 at the time, but he recalls how he and his father went for walks and often stopped for long, rambling conversations with the workers. People, he said, seemed to have more character then. They never hesitated to tell my father what they thought or how they believed things should be done, and my father was always ready to listen. Those were the moments when I learned to love the vines.
Those moments, however, were about to vanish. On May 9th, 1940, Hitler announced to his general staff, "Gentlemen, you're about to witness the most famous victory in history." It was the following day when the Germans poured into France, wreaking destruction in their wake as they moved across the country. And then, little more than a month later, what most French believed would never happen, happened. The Germans were marching down the Champs-Élysées. There had been hardly any resistance. But what happened next was dictated by Field Marshal Hermann Goering. France, he told his soldiers,